Good morning. Thank you all for coming. My name is Young Chen. I'm the Executive Director of the Asian American Bar Association of New York. And we called this press conference this morning to present our second Anti-Asian Violence Report. The title is Endless Tide, the continuing struggle to overcome anti-Asian hate in New York. And before we start, a little bit about Albany. We were founded in 1989 to represent the interests of Asian American and Pacific Islander lawyers, legal professionals, others in the industry in New York City and New York State. Currently, we are at about 1,500 members, which makes us the largest diverse bar association in New York City, New York State, and the United States. We are a New York affiliate of the National Asian Pacific American Bar Association, and we are the largest of about 90 affiliates across North America. I'd like to introduce the co-executive editors of the report. Online with us on Zoom is Sylvia Chin. In the room to my right is Elaine Chu. To her right is Chris Kwok. Also in the room, we have Karen King sitting there in the back. And I see some members of our task force, our Anti-Asian Violence Task Force in the room. I see Tai Chen, Jilan Lee, Karen Yao. It's great to have them here with us. Also want to acknowledge Will Eng, our current president, who's with us this morning. And before we talk about the report itself, just a little bit of context. Albany published its first anti-Asian violence report called Rising Tide in February of 2021 to go over the background, the history and context of the anti-Asian violence that's happening in 2020. And shortly after we published that report in February, we started the Albany Anti-Asian Violence Task Force. And the goal of the task force was to see how Albany could implement some of the proposals and changes we put in the first report. What you see in the second report is a product of some of that work in the past year, but I'll let our executive editors explain more about that. And before we do that, let me introduce our partner from Paul Weiss, our host today, Jennifer Wu.
Thank you. Put this mic back up. So I'm saddened to be here once again today. We're going to go a little off script for this press conference because we have here today Eva Dao, who is the widow of the delivery worker in Queens, who was killed on April 30th, 2022, Saturday night at 9:30 p.m. He was 45 years old when he was shot and he died. Eva has not really spoken out, but feels it's important to come here today because there has not been an arrest in this case, and she is desperate and really hoping for justice in this case. So without further ado, I want to introduce Eva, who's going to speak through our interpreter here today. And Eva is 38 years old, and she is a young mother with 3 children, like me, and I think we all feel for her situation.
大家好，我叫 Eva Dao，我很爱我的先生，我有3个孩子，我们都很想念他，他是我们的一切。我想为我先生的死伸张正义。我很害怕，如果不去抓这个凶手，万一他又出来杀人。我不希望又有另外一个家庭经历这种伤痛，但是我相信警方会尽快抓住这个凶手，为我先生伸张正义。
Good morning, everyone. I love my husband very much. We have 3 children. And we all miss him very much. He means everything for us. I want justice for my husband's murder. I feel scared that if we do not catch this criminal, if he murders someone again, I really don't want to see another family to go through the same kind of pain. But I do have confidence in the police. I believe that they will catch this person soon and will have justice for my husband.
要不要回答这个警方这个记者的问题呢？
Thank you, Eva.
谢谢。
So she may be available later for questions, but not at the moment. So I think, what Eva said, that she's afraid, I think goes to the fact that when Asians are attacked, we all feel afraid and the community feels afraid. So I want to introduce next somebody who knows very much about the community and how they feel, which is Sandra Ong, who is a city councilwoman and a friend.
Good morning. I'm City Councilwoman Sandra Ong. I represent a district that's in Flushing, that's over 70% Asian. It's the largest city council district of Asian Americans. And I actually have read through many recommendations in this report being released today. And I saw that a lot of it was centered on Patrick Mateo, who was the attacker, actually, the Asian woman in my district in February 2021. And he was convicted of a hate crime after it became a focus of community and media attention. And without that, it was likely that Mateo would have been charged with a lesser crime, as so often is the case when other members of the AAPI community are being attacked. It is difficult to point to one cause behind the rise of anti-Asian hate we have seen over the past 2 years. So it stands to reason there isn't going to be one simple solution to combat it. And I really do applaud ABNY and the work that the Anti-Asian Violence Task Force have done through this report. This is said it's been the second report. I just want to say as an elected official, I know there's a lot more we could do in government to fund ABNY, to fund these task forces, to actually fund these reports, and something I would be fighting for. And lastly, I'm here as an elected official, but also as a former member of the Asian American Bar Association and a board member. And I really do very thankful for all of you today for coming out, speaking on this very important topic, and giving us elected officials and law enforcement a roadmap about how to guide us through this anti-Asian American violence against us, not just in dealing with it afterwards, but dealing with how we could prevent it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandra. Next, I want to turn the mic to someone on Zoom, and I'm not sure if he's there. State Senator John Liu, if you're there and you can hear me, you have the floor.
I can hear you, Jennifer. It's great to join you and all of our friends and colleagues at Abani. I just want to make sure you can hear me okay.
We can hear you.
Terrific. I think Councilmember Ong has said some very thoughtful things already. I will add that we clearly have had this incredible spike onslaught of anti-Asian hate. It's been exactly coincident with the COVID-19 crisis. So we see the correlation there, and it's yet another example of Asian Americans being scapegoated for something that has gone wrong in our country. The hate crimes, the violence, the bigotry, the discrimination, and even just stupid and thoughtless gestures and comments. Those are all things that we've dealt with as an Asian American community. The hate crimes in particular are especially troubling because they really lead to a sense of insecurity and lack of safety that too many members of our community have faced. So I know that the Asian American Bar Association of New York, they've been working on this project and this report for quite a while now. They've done this very thoroughly. I've had discussions with some of their preliminary findings and recommendations. I think the insight with which the members of Amani have approached this report with are very valuable to our community, because the reality is that we don't always understand how all the legal proceedings and the law, the application of the law, and what happens in the courts is actually carried out. So the insight of the members of Amani is particularly valuable. They have these 10 very specific recommendations that will be the basis of additional legal remedies that I will pursue along with my colleagues in the legislature. And again, the goal here is to bring back some sense of safety and security to members of the AAPI community who have been through so much. We can see and hear from the voice of this widow how she, it's just hard to imagine that so many weeks have gone by and the authorities still have not found her husband's killer. So it's just yet another reminder that we need and we deserve equal protection, equal justice under the law. And I think that this report will go a long way towards achieving that goal. Thank you, Amani, and thank you to all the members of this committee.
Thank you, John. Safe travels, and hope you get on your bike soon again. So I think next I have the great privilege of introducing my partner, Loretta Lynch, who I think needs no introduction, was the Attorney General of the United States, as well as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of New York. I am gratified to have worked with her on representing victims of anti-Asian hate for about 2 years now, including the widow Eva, who you just met. Thank you, Loretta.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you all for coming here today and expressing your support for Mrs. Zhao, and also all of the victims of what truly is an endless tide of anti-Asian violence that we've seen across our city. And thank you for focusing on this issue. As Jennifer said earlier, it really is heartbreaking that we are here again to discuss this. But that is, frankly, the nature of hate crimes. They spur copycats. They spawn further actions of violence. They lead to a desensitization of the basic humanity that we all share. And they make our world, our country, our city less safe for everyone. This is a level of violence that is today plaguing the Asian American community. They have been targeted like few others have been over the course of the years here. In fact, what I should say is they joined the ranks of so many others in experiencing the pain and the loss from this level of violence, particularly the level of hate that is contained within this violence. We've seen it in the actions, we've seen it in the remarks and comments that are leveled upon victims as they suffer these acts, that these are individuals who are targeted just because of who they are. And sadly, as we say all too many times in this country, this is not us. But unfortunately, I think we are seeing that actually it is, sadly, many of us. It's not all of us. It's not all that we are. But unfortunately, we have seen this rising tide of fear and hatred that believes that recognizing someone else's humanity somehow lessens their own. So in fact, we are seeing this here. Today, we are focusing on the rising tide of anti-Asian violence. Of course, we've seen similar acts of hatred, most recently in Buffalo. We've seen it in Tree of Life. We've seen it in Charlottesville, and we've seen it in Orlando. So the fact that no community is immune does not make any of this less painful, less heartbreaking, or less tragic. In fact, it makes it more so, because having seen it in so many other areas, we need to increase our focus and stop it from continuing to happen here. Working on this issue is a challenge for all of us here today. We at Paul Weiss are tremendously proud to stand with Mrs. Zhao and so many other victims of this senseless violence, but we are also proud to stand with all of you as we all come together to combat this, what is becoming an endemic threat in our society. It may be part of us, but we are better than this. we can make people safe. We can make people feel welcome in their communities. We can give them peace and security. And we can eliminate this hate that is based on nothing more than a distinction without a difference. So thank you all for coming here today. I commend to you the work of Abney. This report today, which you'll get a copy of soon, contains so many exciting and substantive ideas and different points of view. But I also commend to you their previous work. They are not new to this fight. They are not new to this field, and they will not stop working in this area. And we at Paul Weiss are honored to support them. Let me turn the microphone now over to my colleague and friend, Scott Richman from the Anti-Defamation League, to say a few words.
Thank you so much, Loretta, and thank you all for being here today. As Loretta said, my name is Scott Richman, and I serve as the Regional Director for ADL's office covering New York and New Jersey. If you're not so familiar with ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, we've had one goal since 1913 when we were founded, and that's to fight hate. Very sad that an organization needed to be created to fight hate. And we learned the lesson very early on that if one group is suffering, then all groups are suffering. If one group is persecuted, then all groups can be persecuted. So from 1913 on, we focus not just on fighting anti-Semitism. We are a Jewish organization, but fighting all forms of hate. Unfortunately, as Loretta referenced, there are all too many of these incidents. I was in Buffalo for 3 days right after the horrific mass shooting there. Now I find myself here with this. Unfortunately, it goes on. And the problem with hate crimes is that it just doesn't just terrorize the individual, the victim. Of course, it terrorizes people like Mrs. Chow, but it terrorizes everybody who is a part of that group who worries, am I next? Am I going to be the next one? The issue of hate crimes is one that ADL spends a lot of time quantifying. And the issue is very severe, especially here in New York City. So according to our data and NYPD data, hate crimes increased almost 200% from 2020 to 2021. That is a shocking figure. 40% of those attacks were against the Jewish community, but I would say the biggest spike in hate crimes were against the Asian community. We saw an incredible spike last year, and ADL has played a strong role in saying this is not acceptable, but also in being constructive and in saying we are with you. We are your allies. We want to play that allyship role. We do not take the lead. It's organizations like Abney that take the lead, that are out there fighting. But we are your allies. We want to support you, and not just support you with words and not just support you with data, but with ideas. We stand behind you because we've had 109 years of experience, unfortunately, in dealing with this. So what are some of those ideas? Well, of course, one of them is that our elected officials, our leaders need to speak out, and pressing our leaders to speak out. And thank you so much for being here today is of course, very important. They must speak out constructively and forcefully, and we must speak out against leaders who foment this. We saw that in 2020 with rhetoric that was very, very disturbing, which blamed the Asian community for the rise in COVID. Horrific. We also had allegations against the Jewish community for the rise in COVID. And we saw that because we monitor social media, and we saw an incredible rise in anti-Asian rhetoric the moment those statements were uttered. This isn't just something that we know anecdotally. This is something that we have quantified. Very, very unfortunate. Individuals need to play their part as well. There are multiple ways that individuals can play their part, one of which is reporting incidents. We see that people do not report incidents. It's very, very important. We can't fight what we don't know about. We can't fight it if we don't know where it is or what it is or how it manifests itself. Obviously, the work of Abney with fighting using legal tools is very important, but there are many other ways to fight hate, and people must report this. Secondly, we focus on the fact that on social media, there is a huge rise in hate and harassment. ADL quantifies this. In a few weeks, we'll come out with our 4th annual hate and harassment report. Our 3rd one showed that more than 40% of adults who are on social media experience some form of hate and harassment, with a significant number affecting the Asian American community. And I expect that not to go down. Individuals have a role to play in fighting hate and harassment by reporting hate and misinformation on social media. A lot of people rail against what they see on social media, but it's very important for people to speak out and to report that. For example, with Facebook, if you click on the three dots, you can report it and they will do something about it. Nobody wants to have their account suspended or revoked. So each of us has a role to play when we see that. I would also say that we have a role to play in not just this sort of reactive approach to hate, but also being proactive. Anti-bias and anti-bullying education in the schools is critical. We need to create a future where people respect one another and where they respect difference, where they celebrate difference, where they celebrate diversity. And the way to do that is making sure that the next generation is attuned to this, and embodies that respect. ADL has been at the forefront of this. Millions of students are touched every year by ADL's anti-bias and anti-bullying programs, and these need to be implemented much more broadly, especially here in New York City, where we see too few of these kinds of programs. So thank you all so much for being here today. The Jewish community, ADL, stands as your partner in this fight, stands with ABNY, stands with the Asian American community and Pacific Islander community. We, for example, by the way, we were one of the founders of the Asian American Foundation. Our CEO, Jonathan Greenblatt is his name, is the only non-Asian founding board member of the Asian American Foundation, which has put forth substantial funds to be able to fight against this. And it's a very, very important part of who we are. We speak out against this all the time. And I really appreciate you all being here today. Thank you.
So now let me turn it over to two more elected officials who are online over Zoom. State Assemblyperson Ron Kim, are you there?
Yes, I am. Hi, how are you?
Hi, we can hear you, Ron.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Jennifer, Loretta, Scott, and all of our partners who have joined us today at this press conference for ABNY's recommendation of policies that we should take up. Let me also acknowledge my colleagues in government who have championed some of the necessary resources to combat the hatred in the coming months, as well as focusing on long-term solution. Particularly John and I have been pushing for AAPI curriculum to be taught. We had a big win with the mayor last week, which is part of the long-term solution in systemically rooting out the hatred in our communities. But yeah, I mean, we shouldn't be having more of these press conferences and reports. And oftentimes we're left with trying to put as much Band-Aids in the interim so people will stop hating on Asian Americans and hurting our communities. But we also need to continue to focus on what are some of the long-term solutions and have some uncomfortable discussions around economic justice, around the communities of color and immigrants. And the reason why every time we have a social or a economic or health downturn, Asians are always pitted against Black and brown communities. We need to have some tough conversations about how to overcome the economic injustice that pits communities of color against each other. And that's something that will break the cycle of violence, in addition to the legislative, legal fixes that we must implement now. But again, I join my colleagues, and in particular, Jennifer Wu. You've been at this with me for so many years now, including being at the forefront of Yao Palma and his family and many others over the last few months. So thank you for your tireless dedication to providing resources for our communities at a time when we desperately need all the support we can get. Thank you so much.
Thank you for those kind words, Ron. Safe travels. Let me turn it over next to State Assemblyperson Elaine Chu, if you're on. Okay, I know she was having connection difficulties, so let me turn it back to Young, and if she gets on, she'll let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Scott, for your kind remarks, as well as Loretta. Thank you for your words of wisdom. So I want to turn it over now to first Elaine Chu to start going into the findings of the report. Before I do, just a quick mention that this is the last day of May, and May is API Heritage Month. And we think that this is a great opportunity to share with you all some information that we hope will help not just the Asian American community, but all communities that face hate crimes. So, Elaine?
Thanks so much. If I could request slide 3 to be showing, that would be really helpful. Hello, everyone. My name's Elaine Chu, and I'm a professor of law at St. John's University School of Law in Queens County. I'm also proud to be a member of this task force. My job is to introduce you to really 2 sections of this report, and then my colleague Chris Kwok will finish us off with the last 2 sections. We sought to do a couple of things with this report. The first was to kind of update the first report that was written in 2021 and to do a bit of a recap of the year 2021. And so, as Scott Richman talked about and others, there was just first an amazing explosion in anti-AAPI hate and anti-AAPI attacks. Because of that explosion, there was a lot of attention, a lot of press attention, a lot of attention from Americans during the first half of the year, 2021, particularly after the Atlanta shootings in March. After the end of the spring, though, and in particular, after AAPI Heritage Month in May, the attention of Americans and frankly, the attention of the media too seemed to, from our look at it, kind of wane. There was less coverage. And in the end, by the end of the year 2021, our conclusions were that while some steps were taken to address the hate and violence against AAPI Americans, simply not enough had been done. The second part of our report really was something that we wanted to add to what we had been doing with the first report, and that was to look at data. And in particular, what we sought to do was to answer a question it seemed like nobody else was really focusing on, and that's the question of what happens after an incident is reported. Now what? And what we decided to do was to first occupy the perspective of an average New Yorker and seeking an answer to that question. And so with that perspective, what we did was we looked at media sources, and we also looked at what I would call easily accessible, almost meant to be easily accessible digital sources from government agencies like the NYPD or from, for instance, the New York State court system. Using those sources, what we counted was 233 incidents that occurred against Asian New Yorkers in the city of New York in the first 3 quarters of 2021. So 233 incidents were reported. From those 233 incidents, we then noted that 91 incidents led to an arrest. From those 91 incidents with arrests, things were then handed over to our local prosecutors. 41 incidents were charged as hate crimes by the local prosecutors across New York City. And out of those 41, as of basically mid-April of 2022, 7 incidents have ended with a disposition of guilt to a hate crime charge. This work that we did to answer the question with data, what happens after a report? Again, we're not aware of any other study on AAPI hate that has tried to track from beginning to end what happens in our legal system. And we hope that this data will contribute to our conversations. So I'm going to turn it over now to my colleague, Chris Kwok, and if we could move to slide 9. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Chris Kwok. I'm a board member for Abity and one of the co-executive editors. One of the things that we we sort of were feeling and experiencing as we were looking at the numbers was an overall sense. And we felt that it was in an unprecedented era of anti-Asian violence. It was still very difficult for there to be justice and accountability for victims of hate crimes. And that was truly, truly disturbing for us because we spent time on the ground with victims of hate crimes and other incidents that wouldn't qualify as crimes through our HEART program, our Hate Eradication Active Response Team. And in doing so, we were not necessarily representing them, but walking them through the difficulty of dealing with the system, with cultural and linguistic issues often being a barrier. I just want to stop and just note that even though this is, what you've seen and everything is just an amazing professional sort of, take on these things, but Abney is a volunteer organization, except for a wonderful executive director, whose main job actually isn't this, but we all felt we had no choice but to do this. We had to do this. And this is an effort of which we're all proud to be a part of, but there is no funding for this effort. And we do feel that there's a government, as Sandra has recognized and our electeds have recognized, there needs to be funding for this to be done on a professional basis in the sense of it to be funded, right? And we're happy to do it as volunteers. We have no choice but to do it. But I just want to make that point. Where do we land? We have 9 recommendations in the report that we want everyone to, and we see it as a starting point. We don't say this is it and that's the end of the discussion, because we understand that not everyone in the community is going to be on the same page, but we believe we need to have the hard discussion, not only about the things that Ron Kim talked about, but more than that, because we're focused on the victim and how they can find accountability and justice. So for example, I'll just talk about a couple of things from our recommendations. Number 1, improve public hate crime data reporting. We have a bunch of smart people, law professors, former DAs. We're following from the news, through the police, to the DAs, to the courts. We were like, what's going on? And when a bunch of lawyers who should know what's going on really easily don't, that's an issue. So there needs to be some better presentation and collection of the data by government to the public, particularly in these eras. We understand overall it's been a difficult time, but now we've been through it a little bit. There's funding. That funding should go towards better data collection, gathering, and presentation to the public. We think that there should be reform to the hate crime laws. Right now, part of the hate crime law says that it must be whole or in a substantial part motivated by a person's race. We think that presents an obstacle to DAs. We want to make it easier that the hate element can be one part of it. Because when people say in whole or substantial part, it kind of discourages that part. Now, does that mean we want everyone to go to jail and that we need to be, sending everyone there? No, that is not part of our message. Our message is that accountability and justice is part of the solution, but we also think that it needs to be slightly easier for the district attorneys to do that job. And what about, so people go through the system, a lot of people don't go to jail, to divert it to other programs, to training programs, to psychological counseling. We want that to happen. But we think there should be Asian American or anti-Asian hate crime themes and training within that. There doesn't exist that program, except for a program by Elizabeth Ouyang for high schoolers. But we think that there needs to be a program for people that are above that age, for above juveniles. And we want to revisit bail reform. And Governor Hochul has taken that and done that already, but we need to have a conversation. We support the original impulse of bail reform, which is that poor people should not be in jail just because they're poor. But we think there's further conversations about that can be had, like hate crimes maybe should be eligible for bail, and because there's that community element. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll hand it off. Is the question done?
Okay, I think this is the time of the press conference that we have set aside for questions and answers. You guys have been so patient. And so I don't know if anybody has some that they'd like to ask.
Yeah, hi, this is Bobby Kalban with the Associated Press. Is it okay to just jump in here with the question?
Completely okay.
All right. So that 7 cases ended with a hate crime disposition. Is that an acceptable number? And I'm wondering, how does the data on the legal dispositions of hate crimes reports among Asian Americans, how does that compare with other groups?
Yeah, those are two really important questions. So first, is it an acceptable number? I think that that's an interesting choice of words. For us, I do want to say without the immediate reaction was, wow, that's a really low number, especially if we're starting with 233 incidents that, again, the average New Yorker is just hearing about in the first 3 quarters of 2021. But when you kind of dig into and think a little bit harder about, for instance, the incredibly notoriously slow pace of the criminal legal system, probably in every state, but certainly in New York State, and then you exacerbate that, for instance, with COVID, with the changes in discovery law that have really impacted prosecutions. I don't know if I would use the word acceptable, but I think it is explainable. But for the other thing I'll note also is that there are still a lot of open cases. So out of the 41 prosecutions that actually did have hate crime charges, I think it's another 20 that as of mid-April 2022, they had not reached their ending, so to speak, in terms of their story. They had not reached a final disposition. And to your second question.
I'm sorry, is that out of the 233? So how many of them have not reached their final disposition yet?
Yeah, so out of the 233, we were able to track and follow a certain number of the prosecutions. Some of them, as we said, 41 of them had hate crime charges in them. So out of that 41, 20, I know it's a lot of numbers, 20 are still open and pending as cases. And so we anticipate that we'll see more than 7. We anticipate that that number will go up. And that there will be more convictions for hate crimes. It remains to be seen. Right. I think you had a second question.
Yeah,
Bobby.
I did, and that had to do with the data for Asian American hate crimes, how that compares to other groups.
Yeah. So at each stage of the process, I think that was always a question on our mind. So even initially at the stage of, for instance, reporting of incidents, something that Scott Richman made a big emphasis of in his remarks, we definitely ourselves were studying and have noted for ourselves that there is less reporting. And for instance, some of was mentioned linguistic and cultural barriers is part of the problem. And so even at that first initial stage of having incidents reported, I think that AAPI victims definitely show a notable decrease, a smaller number of reports. If you were asking, for instance, whether in later stages of the process, for instance, is the arrest rate, I mean, we all just heard from this widow who, again, just had a very, sad kind of sadness and disappointment and frustration, as we can understand, with the lack of an arrest. Our report didn't cover whether or not there was a noticeable decrease in arrest rates. It's not something that we looked at very deeply, but at the surface, it didn't seem like there was. But at every stage of the process, I think it is a good idea to kind of make these comparisons. This report didn't really take up that question, though.
Yeah, I guess the underlying question.
Yeah. Oh,
I guess
Bobby,
the underlying.
Young Chen also.
Oh, sure, please.
Yeah, if I may. So on the reporting from the community, what Scott Richman said about the need to report so we can have the data is a very important point. But with the Asian community, there's a bind here. It's a vicious cycle where in 2020, we're constantly being told by law enforcement, by elected officials to report. So our community did that. And that's what Elaine's data tracking was meant to do, to see what happens after you report. And what we're finding is a low number of ultimate guilty dispositions. And that leads to the appearance that reporting doesn't get you anywhere. So if we want our community to continue reporting, I think to some extent, there has to be more vigorous enforcement to show that reporting yields result some level of accountability and justice. That's what we're finding.
Well, that's the reason why I kind of drilled down at the numbers, because actually what I consider the relevant number here is that 7 out of 21 ended up with some kind of legal disposition or a guilty disposition, right?
Yeah, 7 out of 41.
Well, you said 20,
that we were tracking.
but you said 20 are still not to its end yet. So that leaves 21 having been fully adjudicated, right? And 7 of those.
Okay. I will say that what's also in the mix is that some reached a mental health disposition, which just given the way the mental health laws work with our criminal legal system, we wouldn't necessarily call that a final disposition. So, for instance, folks have been found through professional medical diagnoses to suffer from mental health, mental illness. And so this is known as a 730 proceeding or finding. And you'll see that talked about in our report. That is not really considered a final disposition because it kind of puts the case in like pending mode. Should they ever recover from their mental illness, perhaps with treatment, for instance, that case will come back and be an active prosecution again. So there's a good amount of those cases mixed in as well. And the report talks a little bit about those cases. So I think I'm going to take a question from Anna. Hi.
One is kind of following up on this. So I guess how many of the cases were maybe dismissed altogether? The ones that didn't have a hate crime charge, which one, like, how would you categorize them? Like maybe they just had an assault charge or how would you categorize the charges that were made on the non-hate crime ones?
Yeah, such a great question. And so out of the prosecutions that we were able to follow and able to get information from through cooperation from local prosecutors' offices, there were about 23 prosecutions that they decided to not bring hate crime charges. And I do think from talking with local prosecutors and their hate crime units that they made the after investigation decision that there just simply was not sufficient evidence. And so they decided to not bring hate crime charges. Now, I think your question as to whether they then brought regular non-hate crime assault charges, menacing charges, whatever. I don't know that off the top of my head. I think if I had to guess, some of them they did. Were some outright dismissals where there were no charges brought? That's entirely possible as well, but I actually don't know that exacting number. But this is when we discovered from speaking with local prosecutors that the word substantial, in whole or in substantial part, is an important word. Every word's important in the statute, but it was a word that local prosecutors definitely pay attention to. And in their view, it's a pretty high bar. And because of that, and again, as you point out, these cases, they found that there was not enough evidence for them to bring charges. And so one of our legislative reform ideas is to take out the word substantial so that it just reads in whole or in part, which many other states have. And that might help make a little bit of a difference there.
And my other question is about the 233. The first 3 quarters of 2021, I know you mentioned, it's a mixture of reports from the news media and, government sources. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering which government sources are you pulling from? Mm-hmm. And then how do you decide what in the news media to use? That's because usually they're reporting from official government numbers themselves. So
right. Yeah. Data collection is so important, but what sources you use is incredibly important, and also, what definition you use. And a lot of that often has to do with what goals do you have. So first, what government sources were we using? We used primarily 2 sources. The first was the Hate Crimes Dashboard, which was specially created by the NYPD as a way to inform the public as to the incidents of hate crimes. And it's a great, rich kind of collection of anti-AAPI incidents, but also anti-Semitic incidents, anti-LGBTQ plus incidents. And so we looked at that. That's released on a quarterly basis. We also looked at something that the mayor's office puts out, which is an email blast. I think it's sent out, I want to say every week. And it basically, in a more immediate way, lets folks know they focused on hate crimes, but they focused on violent felonies specifically that are hate crimes. And so we were privileged to be categorized as one of the community partners. And so we were entitled to get and did get these emails. So those were the two kind of sources that we primarily used. I'm forgetting, did you have, oh, great. So we added to that media and we looked at, fairly traditional news media. And I would say that what we were looking for was whether or not any article or coverage that was written by a journalist would have this sentence, and this was a possible hate crime against an AAPI New Yorker. And this was potentially a hate crime. This was potentially motivated by, right? And again, this was where the idea we had of sitting within the perspective of just a average Asian New Yorker really, I think, helped us to make that decision. Now, whether or not journalists, what they were using to write that sentence, I can't speak to, but we knew that ourselves and our family and friends, they're reading that sentence and their heart rate's going up, right? And so we tried to really sit within that space of where folks would be easily hearing and getting information from and feeling like, oh my God, there are so many attacks.
So it was more like the individual cases that you were pulling from news media as opposed to taking like larger numbers that they were reporting.
That's right. So whenever there were these compilation kind of year-end things, we read them, we noted them, we looked at what criteria they were using. We understood whether they were more privy to information like the NYPD's numbers, but that's not what drove our collection. Any other questions? Great. In the back, I'm sorry, I don't know.
With CBS New York. I was wondering, because I know some first quarter numbers for this year have come out. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at them, and because this I guess situation has gotten a lot of attention in the past year, and I just wonder if there's anything that the community's been doing in the past year, whether it's getting more awareness, the police forming their own hate crimes task force. If you're predicting at all any improvement this year, or do you think we still have to see the worst of this time?
We definitely have noticed that as well, because we're just forever kind of paying attention to coverage and studies out there. And so, yes, we are aware that sources are reporting that the numbers of AAPI hate crimes and attacks are down for 2022 compared to 2021. Our thoughts about that are, should we be celebrating, right? Should we be now thinking that the tide has turned? The tide has turned. I think most of us on the task force are reluctant to kind of, make those conclusions. For instance, there's a couple of things that we wanted to note. We don't know if that has been because there are fewer attacks or simply whether it's frustration and kind of AAPI victims feeling like there's no point to reporting because you're seeing like, wait, there's like, honestly, like very few convictions that they even get to hear about. And so what's the point if that attitude is taking over, even though attacks may be continuing? Another member of our task force recently said, I think, and this is, I think, important. Okay, there may be a decrease, but that decrease is coming after what was a massive uptick, right? And so for us to kind of be celebrating feels certainly, I think, a bit premature. But, as concerned volunteers, as Chris says, and we're certainly going to keep our eye on what's happening. Thanks for the question. Up front.
So I don't know the extent to which your report might have looked at this, but I was curious about what you think can be done at the government level if the anti-bias training is something that, more people in Washington should be exposed to, or if there's some other solution. I ask this because, as was discussed, because in the previous administration, We had a president and other government officials that repeatedly, despite pushback, used rhetoric that implicated, Asian communities and people from certain countries and was very anti-immigrant. I'm wondering, what maybe this report suggests in terms of addressing that level of accountability, as well as like looking at, what police can do to monitor, citizen and interpersonal interactions.
Yeah, I would say that our report definitely, when you looked at the recommendations, has something for every branch of government to do. I think, for instance, we mentioned legislative reform, but a lot of our training ideas were actually also thinking about executive agencies like the NYPD, local prosecutor offices. And there's a lot of specificity, I think, in detail in the recommendations. But if you're asking a slightly different question, which is really, about political rhetoric and what elected or even unelected people say, I would say that I don't think any of our recommendations necessarily speak to that.
No, but as Chris mentioned, we did look into alternatives to incarceration and diversion programs. And unfortunately, there currently are no diversion programs we're aware of that focus on anti-Asian bias. So when we talk about looking to our elected officials to provide funding, I think that's one area of funding that could be very fertile. Because again, to stress the solutions, it's not just about putting people in jail. It's about finding other ways to obtain justice and accountability, which has been in short supply. So right now you're dealing with a situation if you do find somebody guilty, but jail is the wrong place to send them, and you want to send them to the diversion program, it doesn't exist currently. So certainly I think Albany would do whatever it can to help develop those kinds of programs. We would certainly lobby for funding for those. But right now, if you were to try to send somebody to the diversion program, there's nowhere to send them.
Great. Second go. Let's.
Are any of the demographic or geographic data particularly stand out to you as startling or just you could surprise the public?
Yeah, I would say that starting with geography, Manhattan in our count seemed to have, out of the 5 boroughs, the most incidents. And interestingly, we looked at police precincts, and if you had to guess which police precinct in the 5 boroughs had the most incidents, it was actually the Midtown South precinct, which contains Times Square, for instance. And so, and while that precinct may not be, a precinct we typically associate with having lots and lots of AAPI community members, at least perhaps not as residents, it clearly is a very high traffic area of Manhattan. It also may, I think, correlate with perhaps some of our homeless issues and mental health issues in the city as well. On the demographic side, we did find that there was slightly more than half of our victims were women, but it's not like an overwhelming unevenness. I think it's like 45% if I'm remembering correctly, female to male. I think another thing I would say is that, and this is some of, as Bobby was suggesting, more things for us to think about should we write a third report. Age of victims. I think for many of us, the headline seemed to suggest that there was a very pronounced impact or victimization of our elderly. And that may be true if we compare it to historic incidents of violence against elderly Asians. But actually, the higher percentages were in the middle age group. So I would say between like 29 and 49 were actually the majority of our incidents. And again, I think that kind of matches the Midtown South story as well in terms of who's out and about because of work or whatever, shopping responsibilities. so that they're on the streets as opposed to the elderly. So yeah, that's some of what I would share as highlights. Thanks for the question. Hi, Christine. No.
I know there was discussion about how a lot of the community is disheartened with the lack of successful prosecutions. Is this prosecutions in general or specifically for hate crimes charges? Because I know the case of Miss Zhao and her husband, I don't know, like what happened is terrible, but I don't think the police have specifically said this is, a bias crime. So you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah, we were trying to look specifically for whether hate crime charges were brought. Anna's question before was what about regular charges? And so I would say our study was specifically focused on hate crime charges as prosecutions, whether or not there were convictions for hate crimes. And so, it may be important also to note whether they were outright dismissed versus, well, were there just regular crimes brought then? But I think our study was motivated by this idea that the hate crime laws are tools out there and they exist for a reason, and they're capturing some kind of harm and impact that regular crimes don't, right? And so we wanted to kind of zero in on that. Interestingly, I don't know 1,000%, but I'm pretty certain that there has not been an arrest made in the case, right, involving Mrs. Zhao's husband. And without an arrest, we don't know what arrest charges the cops, the NYPD would actually bring. But from what I understand in their investigations, which are ongoing right now, I do think that the Hate Crimes Task Force, is that the right name of the NYPD? The Hate Crimes Task Force they are involved. Anything else?
Well, so Christine, I just want to add to what Elaine just said. I don't know about Mrs. Zhao's case, but in the report, we do talk about the David Kim case from 2020 in Queens, where there's a fender bender. The driver, David Kim, calls the police to get to report it. And after police go away, the guy who ran into David Kim starts to call him racial epithets and then call his friends in to surround him and basically terrorize them for about an hour before the police came again to disband them. And David then went to try to report this to the NYPD. This is 2020, so there were Black Lives Matter protests that he couldn't get in to make that report. Then they tried to go to the Queens DA's office to report it. And apparently he had witnesses in his car for witnesses to these incidents. They had video. They shared this with the Queens DA's office. And for reasons that still are not clear to us, they didn't bring this as a hate crime. So, then he got lawyers. He went back to the Queens DA's office and said, if it's not a hate crime, how about false imprisonment? Because I was, surrounded and terrorized for an hour. No case, go home.
And if I might sort of continue on that theme, and I'm sorry if maybe you've discussed it, is what we heard as a recurring theme was the invisibility that Asian Americans felt before the law. Now, we had wonderful allies here talking about the hate that African Americans have faced and that Jews have faced. They are all in one the same, underlying it, and we want to recognize that. But for Asian Americans within this country, they have been invisible under the law affirmatively before. There were statutes in California in 1850 which said that, it actually said that African Americans, Native Americans, and mulattoes, which are mixed people, could not testify against white people in court. And through a court case in People versus Hall, it was extended to the Chinese and then later to Asians. And we think there's a long history of that invisibility, that Asian Americans feel invisible. Well, there's a reason for that. It's not just by happenstance. There is a legal history, there's an affirmative history, and we want to call that out. And it's being practiced by now. And we don't think there's sort of like active hate, like we're going to ignore you. But it just doesn't exist within the mind of some of the people who are implementing the law. And Abney wants to help, recognize that and make sure that doesn't happen from here on out.
Right. So, so hate and violence are happening against Asian Americans. Maybe not all are hate crimes, but certainly if there are crimes committed, then they should be prosecuted. And also, we feel that, the public has a right to know about it. And right now, for the Asian American community, they're not seeing anything beyond reports of the attacks. So unfortunately, I think the impression that's left is that we can report this, but nothing happens. And so you can attack Asians with impunity. And we need, our elected officials to really change that perception. If there's nothing else, we have copies of the report, hard copies that we encourage you to take with you. And if you have any follow-up reports, follow-up questions, you can email them to me at main, M-A-I-N, at aabany.org. That's AABANY.org. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for the excessive amount of homework you just handed us.
Thank you, John.